How's it going, everybody? My name's Parallax Abstraction, and welcome to Retro Flashback, showcasing gaming's roots for a new generation. So, we are going way old school this time, my friends. This is actually the first ever game we have showcased from turning the Wayback Machine this far. And I've actually been looking forward to this, because this is actually the first console I have ever owned that we are going to be talking about this time. And one that is very widely regarded, both in my gaming life and, well, gaming history as a whole. So we're looking at our first ever game for the Atari 2600, one of many I hope we will be looking at on this show going forward. But this is what I would say is probably my favorite game on the system. I had several that I really liked, but this is probably one of the most inventive, one of the craziest without a doubt. And one of the ones that I keep coming back to that I really, really like. So, today we are taking a look at Yar's Revenge. And, well, you're probably watching this if you're not familiar with this system and going, what the living hell is happening here? This doesn't make a lot of sense. And, well, you would be right. This game really doesn't make a lot of sense. It technically has a backstory, but, I mean, it's like most Atari games, story is really of secondary note here. So, the game is called Yar's Revenge, and you are playing Yar, which is this weird bug-looking thing. And the story of this goes that Yar was actually named in some weird form after the guy who was running Atari at the time, a guy named Ray Kassar, which many blame him in no small part for the downfall of Atari and the subsequent crash that followed. The video game crash is much more complicated a narrative than most people like to make it, so I wouldn't say it was all his fault, but apparently that's what this game was based on. What is Yar taking revenge on? It's not really clear to anybody, but yeah, the story's really not that relevant here. So, this game was actually designed, as most Atari games were at the time, by a single person by the name of Howard Scott Warshaw. And he's actually a really, really interesting guy. He did a whole bunch of stuff at Atari, and he's done a whole bunch of different things since. He actually became a documentary filmmaker for a little while, and he made several movies, including a documentary about the history of Atari that I actually have. This is before YouTube and things like that. It definitely looks like an amateur production, but it's pretty good. I'm just going to suggest that if you want to learn about your gaming history, you should go check out his stuff, and both his documentary, which is really interesting, and his Wikipedia page has a lot of info on him as well. He's an interesting dude. He's actually a licensed psychotherapist now, which is pretty amazing, a pretty cool shift. And he's a famous guy. He made a lot of cool stuff, but this is probably the game most people remember him for the most. Kind of bums me out. He actually spoke at an Ottawa gaming conference recently for developers, and I wish I could have gone, because it would have been really cool to maybe get a chance to talk to him, but oh well. So what are we doing here? Well, so your object is to destroy this thing here at the end. You're trying to take this out with... I'm trying to remember the terminology of this game. Everything in this game actually has a name, though it really doesn't matter. But you're trying to charge up what's called your... What is it? Your Zorlon cannon. That's what it is. That's what this thing is that I'm firing in order to destroy this breach thing. So what you need to do is you've got to try to take out as much of its barrier as you can. You get more points the more of the barrier you can destroy. And then by basically touching the edge of the screen, that's what activates your cannon. And your goal is to time it so that when it flies to the right, it hits the barrier when it hits that edge of the screen, which causes the barrier to blow up and sends you into the next level. And your hazards along the way are that if you're really sloppy, your Zorlon cannon can actually hit you and kill you. But in addition to that, occasionally the barrier will spew out those saw blade-like things at you they will basically sit and prime for a random amount of time. So you saw it when it starts up there. It does not fire with a recognizable pattern, so you got to be prepared for it, and it will always make a beeline right for your position when it launches. So, you see, that was really quick. So you got to make sure you avoid that, and in addition, you want to avoid this little line thing, which I don't remember what it's called, that will follow you around. And as you increase in levels, you can see that the speed at which it moves, as well as the frequency that those saw blades fire, becomes more and more daunting. So, as you can see, the little buggers gets really tough to avoid in some cases. Ooh, almost got that. So, if you need a little bit of a reprieve in order to collect yourself, you can go in this weird center distortion area here, which I think is a really trippy effect for something of that, of a game of this age. Yeah, and I ended out there. So the game does keep score, as you can see. You only get to see the score in between lives or when your game is over. The scoring system in this game is incredibly weird. Some things are handed out in increments of 1,000. Other things are handed out in increments of like 69 and 169 points, which is really strange. So if you need a little bit of a reprieve, you can get into this sort of center distortion zone here, which will make you invulnerable to this line enemy that follows you around. Does not stop following you around. It will follow you in there, but it can't hurt you when you're sitting in this zone. So, as you can see. So, did that on purpose. So, the line cannot hurt you, the saw blade can. So that's the little bit of a... Saw blade don't care about no distortion field. So, that's how that works. And this is really the core concept of this. I mean, most games on the really old systems like this were generally fairly simplistic in nature. Many of them were easy to learn, hard to master, and the simple fact of the matter is that these guys didn't have a lot to work with. They had a very, very slow processor. They had only teeny tiny little bits of memory, and actually a lot of these games involved some real coding wizardry despite that limitation. In order to make some of the games do what they did, they actually had to do some things with the 2600 that the engineers of it I don't think ever really intended. So, simplistic though this may look, this was pretty state-of-the-art at the time, and it's very hard to see, even if you're someone who grew up with these games like I did. In many cases, if you're not an enthusiast for this kind of stuff, it is very hard to look back at stuff of this age and go, my god, how is this ever fun? And blah! Jeez, that was mean. And, you know, a lot of retro snobs will just roll their eyes and go, "Ugh, you people don't get when games were games, man. You just don't understand it." And you know what? No, it's not like that. Games have come a hell of a long way. And to be honest, I wouldn't bemoan anybody who would look at this and go, "Holy crap, I don't know if I can play that." I can, because I have nostalgia for it, and while I love me some high-tech production values, I can look at an older game and appreciate it from the era in which it was intended, as if it was still in the era it was intended. And as a little kid, man, this game blew my frickin' mind. I was never particularly good at it. I was about as good at it as you're seeing right now, which granted, you know, since I was in single-digit age at that point, maybe it was pretty impressive for the time, I don't know. But I still like this game. Yeah, it's weird and it doesn't make any sense, but games don't have to make bloody sense sometimes. And the mechanics of this are just super solid. You know, it controls well, it's a score attack game, which I love any score attack game because they reward practice and advancing your skill and ability. This is another thing you can do as well. If you want extra points, you can both shoot blocks of the force field here. If you bump against them, you'll also eat them away, which will actually yield more points, but obviously is a bit more risky for reasons like that. But I still think this is a lot of fun. It's a super solid game, and it plays really well, and it's weird and kooky, but that's what I really like. There was a lot of good games on the 2600. But in many cases, a lot of them followed the same formula, especially ones that came from a lot of the same designers. It was, here's a particular action that you need to do it as many times as you can under slightly increasing conditions, and you'll get like a single point for each one. And this is sort of similar, but the skill progression in this, I find, is a lot trickier, and the score attack method is a lot more satisfying than a lot of the older Atari titles that maybe don't hold up quite as well now. And this is why I really enjoy this one so much. And I still fire this up on a fairly regular basis, and I have a lot of fun with it. It's just, it still feels super, super solid. And I still think it's one of the better games of its type that was really ever made, to be honest with you. It's just, yeah, it's just really, really, it just does something that's weird and different, and does that very, very well. And, oh, there we go. And I think it's just really good in a kooky kind of way. This is the sort of main mode, but this game actually did make extensive use of the game select switch that the Atari 2600 had on it, which had a number of different modes that could greatly increase the difficulty if you wanted, to the point where it was just bonkers hard, and like killing the thing or activating your cannon required you to do very, very specific things in a very specific order, which could be like mind-crushingly difficult, especially on higher levels. There was also a two-player mode technically, but it was nothing special. It was really just, hey, switch off with somebody to compete with score, and that was not really much of a thing. But woo. But as a score attack game on the 2600, I think this is really one of the best things there was. And for a system that only had, you know, an 8-way joystick with a single button, it worked remarkably well, and had a number of weird mechanics sort of stacked on top of each other that you had to make work together if you really wanted to make the most of it. And it was just a really inventive, kooky thing, and this is something that Howard Scott Warshaw, if you know anything about him, you know is something that came from his head. And it was actually interesting. This is one of a few Atari titles that actually had a weird Easter egg in it. Atari had this obsession with giving their game developers and designers a lot of creative freedom, but at the same time, they didn't want them to take credit for anything. They wanted every game that came out of Atari to be an Atari game, and they wanted it associated with the company, not the individual. So, much to the chagrin of many of Atari's old designers, and this is actually covered in Warshaw's documentary, much to the chagrin of many Atari designers, Atari said, you cannot put your name on this. We will not put your name on this. You are releasing this as an Atari game. We are paying you to make these games, and therefore, that's the end of it. Therefore, you're making them as us, not as yourself. Well, a lot of them didn't like this, and, well, what it ultimately led to in the long run was a lot of the most famous designers from the company leaving and actually forming other companies like, a little one you may or may not have heard of called Activision. Yes, indeed. The original Activision, which is not really the Activision of today, was formed by ex-Atari people. And there were other companies like Magic and things like that that also came from them. And a lot of that was because Atari wouldn't give credit. But some of the more clever designers actually put Easter eggs in their game that would allow them to take credit in some small way. And there was an Easter egg in this. It's pretty hard to trigger. I don't think I have the means to do it. But it's on the Wikipedia page for the game. And it just shows you Howard Scott Warshaw's initials, which is kind of funny because that really doesn't tell you anything about, like, if you didn't know anything about the game, you wouldn't know what that meant. Like, it doesn't say designed by Howard Scott Warshaw. It doesn't even say, you know, it doesn't even say designed by. It just shows initials, where you're kind of like, what does that mean? But that's kind of the thing these guys did, and it was, and this is how they managed to get credit for themselves. And Atari found out about a couple of these and was not too pleased, even though they really didn't give any strong indication of credit or anything like that. And it was rather fascinating, sort of the internal way that these guys would do that. So this is still a great game. I still really like it, and Howard Scott Warshaw, despite the fact that he's not making games anymore, is definitely, he's one of history's great designers. He was one of the guys who was there at the beginning and took creative risks and did cool things. I mean, yeah, technically he was the guy responsible for E.T., which is a game I will look at someday because it needs to be chronicled. But there's a long history behind that I won't get into here. I'll save that for the E.T. video, but he was the guy who designed E.T., but it did not really turn out the way it did because of him. Let's just say that. But he's a fascinating dude, and you should really go check out his history of Atari, because that company, man, there's some weird history in the game industry, but Atari was something else. It was something to be there in the 70s. So let me just say that. But the cool part is, if you want to play this game yourself, there are a ton of ways to do it, and several of them are free. In fact, there are actually web versions, browser versions of this that are totally legitimate and free. I'll put a link in the description, and I'm actually playing around with graphics this episode, so if that actually worked out, maybe you'll see that on the screen here. So you can go do that. Copies of this game are pretty easy to find on cartridge if you want. I think it's been in a couple of Atari compilations as well, though I'm not 100% sure about that. And it was on Xbox Live's sadly ill-fated game room system. I actually have it on there. It still works, but the leaderboards are broken and some other things don't work properly. I don't even know if you can actually still download game room content, but it's technically there if you want to play it on there, though I may not advise that. But I think you should check this out. I mean, if you're trying to build up a historical literacy of games, this is one of the big ones you should check out, in my opinion, in general, if not for the 2600. And even if you just like weird, challenging score attack games, I would recommend this anyway, because it may not look like much, but it is still damn fun. And I'm still not terribly good at it, but it's a great game. So that is Yar's Revenge from Atari, developed by Howard Scott Warshaw and released in May 1982 for the Atari 2600. It's a classic, it is. I recommend checking it out, and if you want to know more about Atari, go check out Once Upon Atari. It's cool, and you'll learn some interesting stuff from it. My name's Parallax Abstraction. Thank you guys for watching. If you like what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps me out a great deal. But I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.